Chapter 7, Psychologism as a Skeptical Relativism. 32. The ideal conditions for the possibility of a theory as such. The STL.ICT concept of skepticism. The worst objection that can be made to a theory, and particularly to a theory of logic, is that it goes against the self-evident conditions for the possibility of a theory in general. To set up a theory whose content is explicitly or implicitly at variance with the propositions on which the sense and the claim to validity of all theory rests, is not merely wrong, but basically mistaken. There are two respects in which one can hear talk of the self-evident conditions of the possibility of any theory whatever. One can talk of these in a subjective respect. Here one's concern is with the a priori conditions upon which the possibility of immediate and mediate knowledge one depends, as also the possibility of rationally justifying any theory. The theory which validates knowledge is itself a piece of knowledge. Its possibility depends on certain conditions, rooted, in purely conceptual fashion, in knowledge and its relation to the knowing subject. It is, for example, part of the notion of knowledge, in the strict sense, that it is a judgment that does not merely claim to state truth, but is also certain of this claim's justification, and actually possesses the justification in question. If the judging person were never in a position to have direct personal experience and apprehension of his judgment's self-justifying character, if all his judgments lacked that inner evidence which distinguishes them from blind prejudices, and yields him luminous certainties, it would be impossible to provide a rational account and a foundation for knowledge, or to discourse on theory and science. A theory therefore violates the subjective conditions of its own possibility as a theory, when, following our example, it in no way prefers an inwardly evident judgment to a blind one. It thereby destroys the very thing that distinguishes it from an arbitrary, unwarranted assertion. It is plain that, by the subjective conditions of possibility, we do not here mean real conditions rooted in the individual judging subject, or in the varied species of judging beings, for example of human beings, but ideal conditions whose roots lie in the form of subjectivity as such, and in its relation to knowledge. We shall distinguish them by speaking of noetic conditions. In an objective respect, talk of the conditions for the possibility of any theory do not concern the theory as a subjective unity of items of knowledge, but theory as an objective unity of truths or propositions, bound together by relations of ground and consequent. The conditions here are all the laws whose foundation lies purely in the notion of theory, or more specifically, in the notions of truth, of proposition, of object, of property, of relation etc., the notions, i.e. which enter essentially into the concept of theoretical unity. To deny these laws amounts to an assertion that all such terms, theory, truth, object, property etc., lack a coherent sense. A theory is self-destroying, in this logical objective respect, if its content offends against the laws without which theory as such can have no rational, no coherent sense. The logical offences of such a theory can lie in its presuppositions, in its forms of theoretic connection, or in the thesis that it sets forth. The violation of logical conditions is at its grossest when the sense of the theoretic thesis involves a rejection of those laws on which the rational possibility of any thesis, and the proof of any thesis, depend. The same holds of noetic conditions and of theories which violate them. We may distinguish, without attempting a classification, between false, nonsensical, logically and noetically absurd, and finally skeptical theories. The last cover all theories whose theses either plainly say, or analytically imply, that the logical or noetic conditions for the possibility of any theory are false. The term skepticism is thus connected with a clear concept and is clearly divided into logical and noetic skepticism. The concept of such skepticism applies to the ancient forms of skepticism with theses such as, there is no truth, no knowledge, no justification of knowledge etc. Our previous treatments have shown too that empiricism, whether moderate or extreme, is an instance of our pregnant concept of skepticism. That it is of the essence of a skeptical theory to be nonsensical, is at once plain from its definition. 33. Skepticism. In the metaphysical sense, the term skepticism is commonly used with some vagueness. Ignoring its popular sense, we find that philosophical theories are called skeptical if they try to limit human knowledge considerably and on principle, and especially if they remove from the sphere of possible knowledge wide fields of real being, or such especially precious sciences as metaphysics, natural science, or ethics as a rational discipline. Among such inauthentic forms of skepticism there is one which is readily confused with the purely epistemic skepticism here defined, which would limit knowledge to mental existence, and would deny the existence or knowability of things in themselves. Such theories are plainly metaphysical, they have no connection with skepticism proper, their thesis is free from psychologism as a skeptical relativism. 77. Logical and noetic absurdity, their claim to validity is a mere question of arguments and proofs. Confusions and genuinely skeptical modifications then only arise from the paralogistic influence of tempting ambiguities or of skeptical convictions elsewhere fostered. If, for example, a metaphysical skeptic states his view in the form there is no objective knowledge, i.e. no knowledge of things in themselves, or all knowledge is subjective, i.e. all factual knowledge is merely the knowledge of facts of consciousness, there is a great temptation to yield to the ambiguity of the subject-object terminology, and to transform the original sense which suits our metaphysical standpoint into a noetic skeptical sense. The proposition all knowledge is subjective becomes the totally new assertion all knowledge as a conscious phenomenon is subject to the laws of human consciousness. The so-called forms and laws of knowledge are merely functional forms of consciousness, or laws governing such functional forms, i.e. psychological laws. When metaphysical skepticism thus wrongly favors epistemological skepticism, the latter, contrariwise, if taken to be self-evident, seems to provide powerful arguments for the former. People reason, for example, logical laws, as laws for our functions of knowing, lack real meaning, we can at least never know if they agree with things in themselves. To assume a profimation system is wholly gratuitous. If the comparison of an item of knowledge with its object, needed to establish an ade quasia reiet intellectus, is excluded by the notion of the thing in itself, this applies also to the comparison of the subjective laws of our conscious functions with the objective being of things and their laws. If there are things in themselves, we can know nothing whatever about them. Metaphysical questions do not concern us here. We have mentioned them only to have before us at an early stage, an instance of the confusion between metaphysical and logico-noetic skepticism. 34. The concept of relativism and its specific forms. In order to criticize psychologism we have yet to discuss the concept of subjectivism or relativism which also is part of the above-mentioned metaphysical theory. One of its original forms is caught in the Pythagorean formula, man is the measure of all things, provided this last is interpreted as saying the individual man is the measure of all truth. For each man that is true which seems to him true, one thing to one man and the opposite to another, if that is how he sees it. We can therefore also opt for the formula all truth and knowledge is relative to the contingently judging subject. If, however, instead of such a subject, we make some contingent species of judging beings the pivot of our relations, we achieve a new form of relativism. Man as such is then the measure of all human truth. Every judgment whose roots are to be found in what is specific to man, in the constitutive laws of man as species, is a true judgment, for us human beings. To the extent that such judgments belong to the form of common human subjectivity, the term subjectivism is in place here too, in talk of the subject as the ultimate source of knowledge etc. It is best to employ the term relativism, and to distinguish individual from specific relativism. The restriction of the latter to the human species stamps it as anthropologism. We turn to criticism. Our interests demand that it should be very careful. 35 Critique of individual relativism. Individual relativism is such a barefaced and, one might almost say, cheeky skepticism, that it has certainly not been seriously held in modern times. It is a doctrine no sooner set up than cast down, though only for one who recognizes the objectivity of all that pertains to logic. One cannot persuade the subjectivist any more than one can the open skeptic, a man simply lacking the ability to see that laws such as the law of contradiction have their roots in the mere meaning of truth, that from these it follows that talk of a subjective truth, that is one thing for one man and the opposite for another, must count as the purest nonsense. He will not bow to the ordinary objection that in setting up his theory he is making a claim to be convincing to others, a claim presupposing that very objectivity of truth which his thesis denies. He will naturally reply, my theory expresses my standpoint, what is true for me, and need be true for no one else. Even the subjective fact of his thinking, he will treat as true for himself, and not as true in itself. 3. That we should, however, be able to convince the subjectivist personally, and make him admit his error, is not important. What is important is to refute him in an objectively valid manner. Refutation presupposes the leverage of certain self-evident, universally valid convictions. Such are those trivial insights on which every skepticism must come to grief, insights which show up skeptical doctrines as in the strictest, most genuine sense nonsensical. The content of such assertions rejects what is part of the sense or content of every assertion and what accordingly cannot be significantly separated from any assertion. 36 Critique of specific relativism and, in particular, of anthropologism. In the case of subjectivism, it is doubtful whether anyone seriously holds it. Modern and recent philosophy leans, however, so strongly towards specific relativism, and, in particular, towards anthropologism, that it is quite rare to encounter a thinker free from the taint of such erroneous doctrines. But such doctrines are, however, skeptical in the sense defined above, and so suffer from the grossest absurdities conceivable in a theory. We find in them, too, slightly masked, an evident contradiction between the sense of their psychologism as a skeptical relativism 79 thesis, and that which cannot be separated from the sense of any thesis qua thesis. It is not hard to show this in detail. One specific relativism makes the assertion, anything is true for a given species of judging beings that, by their constitution and laws of thought, must count as true. This doctrine is absurd. For it is part of its sense that the same proposition or content of judgment can be true for a subject of the species Homo, but may be false for another subject of a differently constituted species. The same content of judgment cannot, however, be both true and false. This follows from the mere sense of true and false. If the relativist gives these words their appropriate meaning, his thesis is in conflict with its own sense. It is plainly a vain evasion to plead that the words of the adduced principle of contradiction were incomplete, but that, when we unfolded the sense of the words true and false, it was the humanly true and false that were in question. For the ordinary subjectivist could likewise plead that talk about the true and the false was inexact, and that truth, or falsehood, for the individual were what was really meant. And one would of course answer him by saying, an evidently valid law cannot have a plainly absurd meaning, and talk of what is true for this one or that one is absurd. It is absurd to regard it as an open possibility that the same judged content, with dangerous ambiguity we say the same judgment, should be alike true and false, as one or other judges it. There will be a corresponding answer to specific relativism. Truth for this or that species, for example for the human species, is, as here meant, an absurd mode of speech. It can no doubt be used in a good sense, but it then means something wholly different, i.e. the circle of truths to which man as such has access. What is true is absolutely, intrinsically true. Truth is one and the same, whether men or non-men, angels or gods apprehend and judge it. Logical laws speak of truth in this ideal unity, set over against the real multiplicity of races, individuals and experiences, and it is of this ideal unity that we all speak when we are not confused by relativism. 2. We saw that the principles of contradiction and excluded middle tell us what pertains to the mere sense of the words true and false. In this regard it is possible to restate our objection in the words, if the relativist says that there could be beings not bound by these principles, this assertion is easily seen as equivalent to the relativistic formula stated above. He either means that there could be propositions or truths, in the judgments of such beings, which do not conform to these principles, or he thinks that the course of judgment of such beings is not psychologically regulated by these principles. If he means the latter, his doctrine is not at all peculiar, since we ourselves are such beings. One need only recall our objections to the psychologistic interpretation of logical principles. But if means the former, we may simply reply, either such beings understand the words true and false in our sense, in which case it is irrational to speak of logical principles not holding, since they pertain to the mere sense of these words as understood by us. We should never dream of calling anything true or false, that was at variance with them. Alternatively, such beings use the words true and false in some different sense, and the whole dispute is then one of words. If, for example, they call those things trees which we call propositions, then the statements in which the logical laws are expressed of course do not hold, but they will also have lost the sense in which we asserted them. It therefore comes out that the sense of the word truth has been totally altered by relativism, which yet pretends to talk of truth in the sense laid down by the logical laws, which is the only sense we all employ when we talk of truth. In a single sense there is only a single truth, in an equivocal sense there are naturally as many truths as there are equivocal uses. 3. The constitution of a species is a fact. From a fact it is only possible to derive other facts. To base facts relativistically on the constitution of a species therefore means to give it a factual character. This is absurd. Every fact is individually and therefore temporally determinate. In the case of truth, talk of temporal determination only makes sense in regard to a fact posited by a truth, provided, that is, that it is a truth about facts. It makes no sense in regard to the truth itself. It is absurd to think of truths as being causes or effects, as we have already indicated. If someone wished to argue from the fact that a true judgment, like any judgment, must spring from the constitution of the judging subject in virtue of appropriate natural laws, we should warn him not to confuse the judgment, qua content of judgment, i.e. as an ideal unity, with the individual, real act of judgment. It is the former that we mean when we speak of the judgment 2x2 equals 4, which is the same whoever passes it. One should likewise not confuse the true judgment, as the correct judgment in accordance with truth, with the truth of this judgment or with the true content of judgment. My act of judging that 2x2 equals 4 is no doubt causally determined, but this is not true of the truth 2x2 equals 4. For if, as anthropologism says, all truth has its source in our common human constitution, then, if there were no such constitution, there would be no truth. The thesis of this hypothetical assertion is absurd, since the proposition there is no truth amounts in sense to the proposition there is a truth that there is no truth. The absurdity of the thesis entails the absurdity of the hypothesis, but, since the hypothesis represents the negation of a valid proposition, having factual content, it admits of falsehood but not of absurdity. No one has in fact ever thought of rejecting as absurd those geological and physical theories which give the human race a beginning and an end in time. The stigma of absurdity therefore taints the whole hypothetical statement, since it connects an antecedent having a coherent, logically possible, sense with an absurd, logically impossible, consequent. The same stigma then taints anthropologism, and extends naturally, mutatis mutandis, to the wider form of relativism. 5. On a relativistic view, the constitution of a species might yield the truth, valid for the species, that no such constitution existed. Must we then say that there is in reality no such constitution, or that it exists, but only for us? But psychologism as a skeptical relativism. 81. What if all men, and all species of judging beings, were destroyed, with the exception of the species in question? We are obviously talking nonsense. The notion that the non-existence of a certain constitution should be based on this very constitution, is a flat contradiction, that the truth conditioning, and therefore existent constitution should condition the truth, among other truths, of its own non-existence. The absurdity is not greatly lessened if we substitute existence for non-existence, and apply our arguments, not to an imaginary species, which from a relativistic standpoint is possible, but to our human species. Our contradiction then vanishes, but not the absurdity associated with it. The relativity of truth means that, what we call truth, depends on the constitution of the species Homo and the laws which govern this species. Such a dependence will and can only be thought of as causal. The truth that such a constitution and such laws subsist must then have its real explanation in the fact of this subsistence. The principles of our explanation must be identical with such laws, again mere nonsense. Our constitution would be cause a sway in respect of laws, which would cause themselves in virtue of themselves, etc. 6. The relativity of truth entails the relativity of cosmic existence. For the world is merely the unified objective totality corresponding to, and inseparable from, the ideal system of all factual truth. One cannot subjectivize truth, and allow its object, which only exists as long as truth subsists, to count as absolutely existent, or as existent in itself. There would therefore be no world in itself, but only a world for us, or for any other chance species of being. This may suit some, but it becomes dubious once we point out that the ego and its conscious contents also pertain to the world. That I am, and that I am experiencing this or that, might be false if my specific constitution were such as to force me to deny these propositions. And there would be absolutely no world, not merely no world for this or that one, if no actual species of judging beings in the world was so constituted as to have to recognize a world, and itself in that world. If we confine ourselves to the only species actually known to us, animal species, then a change in their constitution would mean a change in the world, and that although animal species are thought to be evolutionary products of the world, we are playing a pretty game. Man evolves from the world and the world from man. God creates man and man God. The essential core of this objection lies in the self-evident conflict between relativism and the inner evidence of immediately intuited existence, i.e. with the evidence of inner observation in the legitimate, indispensable sense. The inner evidence of judgments resting on intuition is rightly contested when such judgments intentionally transcend the content of the actual data of consciousness. They have true inward evidence when their intention rests on this content itself, and finds fulfillment in it, just as it is. This inner evidence is not attainted by the vagueness of all such judgments. One need only think of the ineliminable vagueness of the determination of time, and perhaps also of place, in any immediate judgment of intuition. 37. General observation. The concept of relativism in an extended sense. Our two forms of relativism are special cases of relativism in the widest sense of the word, as a doctrine which somehow derives the pure principles of logic from facts. Facts are contingent. They might very well not have been the case. They might have been different. If the facts then differ, logical principles also will differ. They will also be contingent, with a being relative to the facts on which they are founded. I do not wish to counter this by merely bringing in the apodictic inner evidence of logical laws, points argued for in former chapters. I wish to bring in another point which is more important in this context. Compare 32 of the present chapter. Anyone can see from my statements up to this point that for me the pure truths of logic are all the ideal laws which have their whole foundation in the sense, the essence or the content, of the concepts of truth, proposition, object, property, relation, combination, law, fact, etc. More generally stated, they have their whole foundation in the sense of the concepts which make up the heritage of all science, which represent the categories of constituents out of which science as such is essentially constituted. Laws of this sort should not be violated by any theoretical assertion, proof or theory, not because such a thing would render the latter false, so would conflict with any truth, but because it would render them inherently absurd. An assertion, for example, whose content quarrels with the principles whose roots lie in the sense of truth as such, is self-cancelling. For to assert, is to maintain the truth of this or that content. A proof whose content quarrels with the principles rooted in the sense of the relation of ground and consequent, is self-cancelling. For to prove, is to state that there is such and such a relation of ground and consequent etc. That an assertion is self-cancelling, is logically absurd, means that its particular content, sense, meaning, contradicts the general demands of its own, pertinent meaning categories, contradicts what has its general root in the general meaning of those categories. It is now clear that, in this pregnant sense, any theory is logically absurd which deduces logical principles from any matters of fact. To do so is at variance with the general sense of the concepts of logical principle and fact, or, to speak more precisely and more generally, of the concepts of truth based on the mere content of concepts and truth concerning individual existence. It is easy to see that the objections against the above discussed relativistic theory are, in the main, objections to relativism in the most general sense. 38. Psychologism in all its forms is a relativism. In our attacks on relativism, we have of course had psychologism in mind. Psychologism in all its sub-varieties and individual elaborations is in fact the same as relativism, though not always recognized and expressly allowed to psychologism as a skeptical relativism. 83. Be such. It makes no difference whether, as a formal idealism, based on a transcendental psychology, it seeks to save the objectivity of knowledge, or whether, leaning on empirical psychology, it accepts relativism as its ineluctable fate. Every doctrine is ipso facto relativistic, a case of specific relativism, if, with the empiricists, it treats the pure laws of logic as empirical, psychological laws. It is likewise relativistic, if, with the a priorists, it deduces these laws, in more or less mythic fashion, from certain original forms or modes of functioning of the human understanding, from consciousness as such, conceived as generic, human, reason, from the psychophysical constitution of man, from the intellect as ipswich, as an innate, generically human, disposition, precedes all actual thought and experience. All the objections we have made to specific relativism also affect such doctrines. One must of course take the somewhat shifting keywords of a priorism, for example understanding, reason, consciousness, in the natural sense which gives them an essential connection with the human species. It is the curse of the theories under consideration that they at one time give these words a real, at another time an ideal sense, and so weave an inextricable tangle of true and false statements. A prioristic theories, to the extent that they yield to relativistic motives, must be counted as relativistic. Such relativism is no doubt restricted, i.e., to the realm of mathematics and natural science, when, as in the case of some Kantian thinkers, certain logical principles are set aside as principles of analytic judgments, but skeptical absurdities are not thereby avoided. For, in their narrower field, they still deduce truth from generic human nature, the ideal from the real, or, more precisely, the necessity of laws from the contingency of facts. We are, however, more interested in the extreme, consistent psychologism which permits no such restrictions. To such a psychologism the main English empiricists, as well as the more recent German logicians, belong, i.e. thinkers such as Mill, Bain, Wundt, Sigwart, Erdmann and Lupes. To criticize all such works is neither possible nor desirable. In view, however, of the reformatory aims of these prolegomena, I do not wish to pass over the main works of modern German logic, and especially not the important work of Sigwart, which, more than any other, has pushed logic in the last decades into psychological channels. 39 Anthropologism. In Sigwart's logic, isolated statements of a psychologistic tone and character are to be found, as passing misunderstandings, in thinkers whose logical works have a consciously anti-psychologistic tendency. This is not so in the case of Sigwart. Psychologism is in his case not an unessential, eliminable addition, but the systematically dominant, basic conception of his work. Right at the beginning of this work, he expressly denies that the norms of logic, not merely technical, methodological rules, but the principles of pure logic, the law of contradiction, of sufficient ground etc., can be otherwise known than by studying the natural powers and types of functioning that these norms are to regulate. Logic, 12, p. 22. His whole mode of treating the discipline accords with this conception. Logic, according to Sigwart, is divided into an analytic, a law-giving and a technical part. If we ignore this last, as not concerning us here, the analytic part has as its task to investigate the nature of the function for which rules must be found. On this the law-giving part is built, which has to set up the conditions and laws of its normal functioning, opposite 4, p. 16. The demand that our thought should be necessarily and universally valid, if kept to the known functions of the judgment in all its factors and conditions, yields definite norms which judgment must satisfy. These demands are concentrated in 2 points, L, that the elements of the judgment should be completely definite, conceptually fixed, and, 2, that the act of judging should arise necessarily out of its presuppositions. This part therefore embraces the doctrine of concepts and syllogisms as a whole set of normative laws for the formation of perfect judgments, opposite p. 20f. In other words, this part contains all the principles and laws of pure logic, to the extent that these are envisaged by the traditional or the Sigwartian logic, and to Sigwart these principles and laws really have a psychological foundation. His detailed statements agree with this program. Nowhere does he remove the laws and theorems of pure logic, and the objective elements out of which they are constituted, from the flux of psychological and practical research into knowledge. Sigwart always talks of our thought and its functions, where he is trying to characterize logical necessity, with its ideal legality, as opposed to psychological contingencies. Pure laws like that of contradiction or sufficient ground, are constantly called laws of functioning or fundamental forms of the movement of our thought, opposite p. 184 and the whole context of pp. 184-5. We read, for instance, though negation is rooted in a movement of our thought which goes beyond reality, and applies contents to one another that cannot be combined, yet there can be no doubt that Aristotle's principle only purports to touch the nature of our thought, opposite p. 253. The absolute validity of the law of contradiction, and of the consequent laws which deny a contradictio in agito, we read in another passage, rests on our immediate consciousness that we always do and always will do the same thing when we deny, opposite p. 386. The same holds, on Sigwart's view, of the law of identity, as principle of agreement, and of all purely conceptual propositions and propositions of pure logic. For we read statements like the following: if we reject the possibility of knowing something as it is in itself, if being is no more than one of the ideas produced by ourselves, it still remains the case that objectivity is attributed by us to such ideas as we produce. Psychologism as a skeptical relativism. 85 with a consciousness of necessity, and that, whenever we treat anything as existent, we assert thereby that all other thinking beings, even purely hypothetical ones, endowed with the same nature as ourselves, must produce it with the same necessity. Opposite p7f, the same anthropological tendency pervades all the statements relative to basic logical concepts, and in the first place to the concept of truth. It is, says Sigwart, a fiction, that a judgment could be true if we abstract from the fact that some intelligence thinks such a judgment. A philosopher who speaks in this manner has accepted a psychologistic reinterpretation of truth. On Sigwart's view, it would be a fiction to speak of truths that hold in themselves unknown to anyone, for example such truths as transcend men's capacity for knowledge. An atheist, at least, who rejects superhuman intelligences, could not speak in this fashion, nor could such as we, before we have proofs that there are such intelligences. The judgment expressed in the formula of gravitation was not true before the time of Newton, which makes it, strictly speaking, a self-contradictory and wholly false utterance, since an unrestricted validity for all times is plainly part of what it means to assert. To go further into Sigwart's many statements which concern the notion of truth would involve us in an inadmissibly long treatment. But it would at least show that we were right in taking the passage we quoted literally. Sigwart resolves truth into conscious experiences. Though he often talks of objective truth, he renounces its true objectivity, which depends on its supra-empirical ideality. Experiences are real particulars, temporally determinate, which come into being and pass away. Truth, however, is eternal, or, better put, it is an idea, and so beyond time. It makes no sense to give truth a date in time, nor a duration which extends throughout time. Naturally one says of truth that on occasion it comes to mind, and is accordingly apprehended or experienced by us. But such apprehension, experiencing and coming to consciousness, are spoken of in quite a different sense in relation to ideal being, from what they have in relation to empirical, individualized being. We do not apprehend truth as we apprehend some empirical content which comes up, and again vanishes, in the stream of mental experiences. Truth is not a phenomenon among phenomena, but is an experience in that totally different sense in which a universal, an idea, is an experience. We are conscious of truth, as we are in general conscious of a species, for example of the color red. A red object stands before us, but this red object is not the species red. Nor does the concrete object contain the species as a psychological or metaphysical part. The part, the non-independent moment of red, is, like the concrete whole object, something individual, something here and now, something which arises and vanishes with the concrete whole object, and which is like, not identical, in different red objects. Redness, however, is an ideal unity, in regard to which it is absurd to speak of coming into being or passing away. The part, moment, red is not redness, but an instance of redness. And, as universal objects differ from singular ones, so, too, do our acts of apprehending them. We do something wholly different if, looking at an intuited concretum, we refer to its sensed redness, the individual feature it has here and now, and if, on the other hand, we refer to the species redness, as when we say that redness is a color. And just as, while regarding some concrete case, we refer, not to it, but to its universal, its idea, so, while regarding several acts of such ideation, we rise to the inwardly evident recognition of the identity of these ideal unities which are meant in our single acts. These unities have identity in the authentic, strictest sense, they are identical species, or are species of the same genus, etc. Truth now is likewise an idea, like any other idea it is given in an act of ideation based upon an intuition. This last naturally is the act of insight, and we are evidently clear as to truth's unity and identity over against the dispersed multitude of concrete, compared cases of inwardly evident judgment. And just as, in other cases, the being or holding of something general amounts to an ideal possibility, i.e. a possibility in regard to the being of empirical cases falling under the general idea, so too in this case, the statements it is the truth that, and there could have been thinking beings having insight into judgments to the effect that, are equivalent. If there are no intelligent beings, if the natural order excludes them, or if they are, in a real sense, impossible, or if there are no beings capable of knowing certain classes of truths, then such ideal possibilities remain without fulfilling actuality. The apprehension, knowledge, bringing to consciousness of truth, or of certain classes of truths, is nowhere ever realized. Each truth, however, remains in itself what it is, it retains its ideal being, it does not hang somewhere in the void, but is a case of validity in the timeless realm of ideas. It belongs to the realm of the absolutely valid, into which we fit all cases of validity into which we have insight or at least well-founded surmises, and in which we further locate the vaguely presented range of things indirectly and indefinitely thought valid, i.e. the cases of validity not as yet known to us, and perhaps never to be known. In this situation, Sigwart does not seem to me to press forward to a clear position. He would like to save the objectivity of truth, and not let it sink under the tide of subjective phenomenalism. But, if we inquire just how Sigwart's psychological epistemology hopes to penetrate to the objectivity of truth, we come upon statements like the following: the certainty of keeping to a judgment, of the irrevocability of a synthesis, that I shall always say the same thing 5. This certainty can only be present when I see that it does not rest on momentary, variable, psychological motives, but on something that stays unalterably the same wherever I think, and is immune from all change. This, on the one hand, psychologism as a skeptical relativism 87 is my self-consciousness itself, the certainty that I am and that I think, that I am I, the being who now thinks and who has thought, who thinks of this and that. On the one hand, it is what I judge about, what I think of, in its invariant content, recognized as identical by myself which is quite independent of the individual states of the thinker. Opposite 39.2, p. 310, a psychologism consistent in its relativism will naturally here apply, not merely individual variation, but pervasive constancies, such as the whole invariant content and the abiding functional laws that govern it, are psychological facts. If there are such traits and laws essentially common to all men, then they make up the specific nature of man. All truth in its universal validity is therefore relative to the human species, or, more generally, to some species or other of thinking beings. If species differ, so do truths and laws of thought. We for our part would say, universal likeness of content, and constant functional laws of nature which regulate the production of such content, do not constitute a genuine universal validity, which rather rests upon ideality. If all creatures of a genus are constitutionally compelled to judge alike, they are in empirical agreement, but, in the ideal sense demanded by a supreme-empirical logic, there might as well have been disagreement as agreement. To define truth in terms of a community of nature is to abandon its notion. If truth were essentially related to thinking intelligences, their mental functions and modes of change, it would arise and perish with them, with the species at least, if not with the individual. With the genuine objectivity of truth, the objectivity of being, even the objectivity of subjective being or the being of the subject, would be gone. What if, for example, no thinking being were capable of seriously postulating its own being? Then such thinking beings would be and also not be. Truth and being are categories in the same sense, and plainly correlative. Truth cannot be relativized, while the objectivity of being is maintained. The relativization of truth presupposes the objective being of the point to which things are relative. This is the contradiction in relativism. Sigwart's doctrine of universality is in harmony with the rest of his psychologism. We must treat it here, since the ideality of truth presupposes the ideality of the universal, the conceptual. On occasion he says in jest that the universal as such is only in our heads. Opposite p. 103 note more seriously he remarks that it is something purely inward, depending on nothing but the inner power of our thought. Opposite 45.9, p. 388. One may undoubtedly say this of our conceptual presentation, as a subjective act having this or that psychological content. But the what of such presentation, the concept, can in no sense be regarded as a real part of this psychological content, as something here and now, which comes and goes with the act. It can be meant, but not produced, in our thought. Sigwart is consistent in practicing the same relativization he uses on the notion of truth on the very closely connected concepts of ground and necessity. A logical ground, he says, that is unknown to us, is, in strictness a contradiction, for a ground only becomes a logical ground when we know it. Opposite 32.2, p2t8. The statement that mathematical theorems have their ground in mathematical axioms therefore relates, in strictness, to a fact of human psychology. Could we still hold this fact to be a fact whether or not anyone knew, knows or will know it? The usual manner of speaking, which gives objectivity to relations of ground and consequent, and talks of their discovery, must accordingly be mistaken. Despite Sigwart's earnest attempts to distinguish essentially different notions of ground, and the acuteness he shows therein, an acuteness only to be expected in so eminent a thinker, he is still hindered by the psychologistic tendency of his thought from making the most essential distinction of all, one which presupposes a sharp sundering of ideal from real. When he opposes the logical ground or ground of truth to the psychological ground of certainty, he finds the former merely in a certain universal likeness, a likeness of what is presented, since only this, not an individual's mood etc., can be common to all. We need not reiterate the objections raised above. The fundamental distinction between a purely logical ground of truth and a normatively logical ground of judgment is not to be found in Sigwart. On the one hand, a truth, not a true judgment, but the ideally valid unity, has a ground, which is tantamount to saying that there is a theoretical proof which deduces the truth from this objective, theoretical ground. The principle of sufficient ground is to be taken in this sense, and in this alone. And on this acceptation of ground, it is not at all the case that every judgment has a ground, let alone that it implicitly asserts such a ground. Every principle of inference, every genuine axiom, is in this sense groundless, as in the opposite direction likewise every judgment of fact. Only the probability of a fact can be grounded, not the fact itself, or the judgment of fact. The expression ground of judgment, on the other hand, if we ignore the psychological grounds or causes of judging and their motivating contents 6, means no more than our logical right to judge. In this sense, every judgment certainly claims this right, though there are objections to saying that the right is implicitly asserted. This means that we may demand of each judgment that it should declare to be true what is true. As craftsmen of knowledge, i.e. logicians in the ordinary sense, we must demand many things of our judgments with an eye to the further growth of knowledge. If these are unfulfilled, we reproach a judgment with logical imperfection, with groundlessness. The latter expression certainly involves a stretching of the word's ordinary meaning. There are similar objections to Sigwart's statements about necessity. We read, if we are to talk intelligibly, all logical necessity ultimately presupposes the existence of a thinking subject whose nature it is to think in this psychologism as a skeptical relativism 89 manner, opposite 33.7, p. 262. Or we may follow up his statements regarding the difference between assertoric and apodeictic judgments, which Sigwart thinks unessential, since in every judgment uttered in full consciousness, the necessity of uttering it is also asserted, opposite 31.l, p. 230/f. Sigwart has not given reciprocal distinctness to two totally different concepts of necessity. The subjective necessity, the compulsive conviction, which colors every judgment, or rather, appears in each such judgment when, remaining under its sway, we try to assert its contrary, is not distinguished from entirely different concepts of necessity, from apodeictic necessity, in particular, the peculiar consciousness in which we apprehend law, or conformity to law, with insight. The latter, really twofold, concept of necessity is really quite lacking in Sigwart. He quite ignores the fundamental equivocation which permits us to apply the term necessary, not only to our apodeictic consciousness of necessity, but also to its objective correlate, i.e. the law, or the conformity to the law, of which this consciousness represents the insight. It is only in the latter sense that the expressions it is necessary that. And it is a law that. Gain their objective equivalence, and likewise the expressions is necessarily P and SS being Pi's grounded on a law. It is naturally the second, purely objective, ideal notion, which underlies all apodeictic judgments in the objective sense of pure logic. It alone dominates and constitutes all theoretical unity. It determines the meaning of a hypothetical combination as an objectively ideal form of propositional truth. It connects the conclusion as a necessary, ideally law-governed, consequence with the premises. How little Sigwart does justice to these differences, how deeply he is enmeshed in his psychologism, is shown by his treatments of Leibniz's fundamental distinction between veritas de raison et il/est de fate. The necessity of both sorts of truth, Sigwart thinks, is ultimately hypothetical, for from the fact that the contrary of a factual truth is not impossible a priori, it does not follow that it is not necessary for me to assert it, once the fact has occurred, or that the opposite assertion would be possible for one who knows the fact, opposite 31.6, p. 239. And again, on the other hand, our possession of universal concepts on which propositions of identity rest, is ultimately a factual matter, which has to be there before the principle of identity can be applied to it, and so can generate a necessary judgment. From which he thinks he can conclude that Leibniz's distinction in respect of necessity, breaks down, opposite p. 240. What is here maintained at the outset is quite correct. Every judgment, while I make it, represents a necessary assertion for me, as its denial, while I remain sure of my judgment, represents an impossibility for me. But does Leibniz intend this psychological necessity when he denies necessity, rationality to factual truths? It is likewise certain that one can know no law without possessing the universal concepts out of which it is built. This possession, certainly, like the whole knowledge of a law, is a factual matter. But did Leibniz call the knowing of a law necessary, and not rather the truth of the law that we know? The necessity of the verite de raison surely accords quite well with the contingency of the act of judgment, to the extent that this amounts to insight and knowledge. Only through a confusion of two essentially different concepts of knowledge, a subjective, psychologistic concept and Leibniz's subjective, idealistic one, can Sigwart wind up his argument by holding that Leibniz's distinction in respect of the character of necessity breaks down. There is undeniably a subjective, experiential distinction which corresponds to the fundamental objective ideal distinction between law and fact. If we never had experienced the consciousness of rationality, of apodeicticity in its characteristic distinction from the consciousness of facticity, we should not have possessed the concept of law, nor been able to distinguish fact from law. We should not have been able to distinguish generic, ideal, law-determined, generality from universal, factual, contingent, generality, nor necessary, i.e. law-determined, generic, implication from factual, i.e. contingently universal, implication. This follows from the fact that concepts not given as combinations of known concepts, nor as combinations of known forms of combination, could only have arisen in us from an intuition of individual instances. Leibniz's veritas de raison are merely the laws, i.e. the ideal truths in the pure and straight sense, which are solely rooted in our concepts, which are given and known to us in pure, apodeictically evident generalizations. Leibniz's veritas de fate are individual truths. They form a sphere of propositions which, even if expressed in universal form, for example all southerners are hot-blooded, are, above all, assertions of existence. 40 Anthropologism in the logic of B. Erdmann Sigwart provides us with no explicit discussion of the relativistic consequences implicit in his whole treatment of the fundamental concepts and problems of logic. The same holds of Wundt. Wundt's logic gives even freer rein to psychological motives than Sigwart's. It contains long epistemological chapters, but hardly touches on ultimate doubts of principle. The same is true of Lup's, in whose logic psychologism is so originally and consistently sustained, so free from compromise and so thoroughly carried out in all branches of the discipline, as has not been the case since the time of Bennick. Erdmann is in a quite different case. At considerable length, and with instructive consistency, he decidedly comes down on the side of relativism, and points to possible changes in the laws of thought as a counter to the presumption which thinks that it can overleap the limits of our thought and find a standpoint for us beyond ourselves. B. Erdmann, Logic, R1, 60, NR 370, p. 378f. It will be useful to consider his teaching further. Erdmann begins by refuting the opposed standpoint. By a great majority, we read, Psychologism as a skeptical relativism 91 it has been maintained, since Aristotle, that the necessity of these, logical, principles is unconditional, their validity therefore eternal. The decisive reason for this has been sought in the impossibility of thinking judgments that contradict them. But this only proves that these principles mirror the essence of our presentation and thinking. For if they reveal this, it will not be possible to carry out their contradictories, since these seek to abolish the condition to which all our presentation and thinking, and so all our judgment, is bound. Opposite. NR 369, p. 375, some words on the sense of this argument, which seems to run, from the impossibility of successfully denying these principles, it follows that they mirror the essence of our presentation and thought, for, if they do so, this impossibility will necessarily follow. This cannot be the argument. For I cannot conclude from the fact that A follows from B, that B follows from A. The thought plainly is only that the impossibility of denying logical principles is explained by supposing that these principles mirror the essence of our presentation and thought. By this last we mean that they are laws stating what generally pertains to human presentation and thought as such, that they state conditions to which all our presentation and thinking are bound. Because they do this, judgments which contradict and deny them cannot, on Erdmann's view, be entertained. I can, however, neither approve this inference, nor the assertions which enter into it. It seems quite possible to me that, just on account of those laws to which all creatures, for example a man's, thinking is subject, individual judgments may be framed denying the validity of these laws. The denial of these laws contradicts their assertion, but the denial as a real act is quite compatible with the objective validity of the laws, or with the real operation of the conditions on which the laws pronounce generally. If contradiction is an ideal relation among the contents of judgments, we are here dealing with a real relation between an act of judgment and its governing conditions. If it were the case that the laws of the association of ideas basically governed human presentation and judgment, as the association psychology actually taught, should we then, we may ask, have to reject as absurd and impossible that a judgment denying these laws should itself arise through their working? Compare 22 above. But even if the argument were sound, it must fail of its purpose. For the logical absolutist, sit venia verbo, could rightly object, the laws of thought of which Erdmann speaks, are either not those laws of which I and everyone else speaks, in which case my thesis is untouched, or he attributes a character to them which is quite at variance with their sense. And again he would object, the impossibility of thinking the negation of these laws, which those laws themselves are thought to entail, is either what I and everyone mean by such an impossibility, in which case it supports my conception, or it is something different, in which case I am again untouched. As regards the former alternative, the principles of logic only express certain truths whose roots are to be found in the mere sense, content, of such concepts as truth, falsehood, judgment, proposition, etc. But Erdmann calls them laws of thought, laws which express the essence of our human thinking. He thinks they state the conditions by which all human presentation and thinking are bound, that they would change, as he thereupon explicitly says, with a change in human nature. They accordingly have, on Erdmann's view, a real content. This, however, contradicts their character as purely conceptual propositions. No proposition whose roots lie in mere concepts, which merely states what those concepts contain, and what is given with them, makes an assertion about the real. One need only consider the genuine sense of the laws of logic to see that they do not do this. Even where they speak of judgments, they do not refer to what psychological laws seek to indicate by this word, i.e. judgments as real experiences, but they mean judgments in the sense of statement meanings in specie, meanings which retain their identity whether serving to found actual acts of assertion or not, and without regard as to who asserts them. If logical laws are treated as laws of the real GZs, which, like natural laws, govern our real presentation and judgment, their whole sense is altered, as has been discussed at length above. One sees the danger of calling the principles of logic laws of thought. They are only laws of thought, as we shall show more precisely in the next chapter, in the sense of being laws that have a part to play in the governance of our thinking, a mode of expression that shows that we are dealing with a practical function, a mode of use, and not with something that enters into their content. That they express the essence of thought could be given a good sense in view of their normative function, provided the condition were fulfilled that in them lay the necessary and sufficient criteria for assessing the correctness of each judgment. Thus the matter was conceived by traditional rationalism, which never became clear that logical principles are no more than trivial generalities, with which our assertions may not clash on pain of being absurd, and that the harmony of thought with these norms guarantees no more than its formal consistency. On this ground it would be quite unfitting to go on speaking in this ideal sense of the essence of thinking, and to define it in terms of these laws 7 which, as we know, only keep us free from formal absurdity. It is a residue of rationalist prejudice that, even in our time, men speak of formal truth instead of formal consistency, a most deplorable, because misleading, play on the word truth. Let us pass, however, to our second point. The impossibility of denying the laws of thought is conceived by Erdmann as the impossibility of performing such a denial. But we logical absolutists think these two concepts so little identical, that we deny the non-performability altogether, while maintaining the impossibility. It is not the act of denial that is impossible, this would mean, since it pertains to something real, that it is a real impossibility. Psychologism as a skeptical relativism 93, but it is the negative proposition which forms its content that is impossible, and this content, being ideal, is ideally impossible, which means that it is absurd, and therefore self-evidently false. This ideal impossibility of the negative proposition does not clash with the real possibility of the negative act of judgment. The last remaining equivocation should thus be eliminated, and we should say, with complete clarity, that the proposition is absurd, but that the act of judging it is not causally ruled out. In the actual thought of normal persons the actual denial of a law of thought does not usually occur, but it can scarcely be said that it cannot thus occur, since great philosophers like Epicurus and Hegel have denied the law of contradiction. Perhaps genius and madness are in this respect allied, perhaps there are also lunatic rejectors of the laws of thought, these will certainly also have to count as men. One should also reflect that it is in the same sense impossible to think the negation of the consequences of primitive logical principles as the negation of these principles themselves. It is well known, however, that we can be mistaken regarding complicated syllogistic or arithmetical theorems, and this too is an unassailable argument. These are, however, disputed questions that do not touch anything essential. Logical impossibility, as absurdity of an ideal content of judgment, and psychological impossibility, as the non-performability of the corresponding act of judgment, are heterogeneous notions, even if the latter were to go with the former in all human cases, and the acceptance of absurdities were ruled out by natural laws. Compare the discussions of 22 in chapter 1v. The logical absolutist makes use of the genuine logical impossibility of contradicting the laws of logic as an argument for the eternity of these laws. What does such talk of eternity mean? Only that every judgment is bound by the pure laws of logic without regard to time and circumstances, or to individuals and species. This being bound is not meant psychologically in the sense of a thought compulsion, but in the ideal sense of a norm. Whoever judges differently, judges quite wrongly, no matter what species of mental creatures he may belong to. A relation to mental creatures plainly puts no restriction upon universality. Norms for judgments bind judging beings, not stones. This is part of their sense, and so it would be ridiculous to treat stones and similar entities as in this respect exceptions. The logical absolutist's proof is now very simple. He will simply say, the following thought chain is one into which I have insight. Such and such principles are valid, and their validity depends merely on unfolding the content of their concepts. Any proposition, i.e. any possible content of judgment in the ideal sense, is therefore absurd, if it either immediately or mediately clashes with such principles. Such a mediate clash merely means that a purely deductive chain runs from the hypothetical truth of such contents of judgment to the consequent untruth of the principles in question. If then such contents of judgment are absurd, and as such false, any actual judgment which has them as its contents will be incorrect, since a judgment is called correct when what it judges, i.e. its content, is true, and incorrect when this content is false. I stress the reference to every judgment, to make plain that the sense of this strict universality rules out any restriction eo ipso, and so also the restriction to human or other kinds of judging persons. I can compel nobody to see what I see. But I myself cannot doubt, I once more see, here where I have insight, I am embracing truth itself, that all doubt would be mistaken. I therefore find myself at a point which I have either to recognize as the Archimedean point from which the world of doubt and unreason may be levered on its hinges, or which I may sacrifice at the peril of sacrificing all reason and knowledge. I see that this is the case, and that in the latter case, if it were then still reasonable to speak of reason or unreason, I should have to pack in all rational striving for truth, all assertion and all demonstration. On all these points I find myself in conflict with our distinguished thinker who, following on the above citations, proceeds as follows. The necessity thus established of the formal logical laws could only be an unconditional one, if our knowledge of it were such as to guarantee that the essence of the thought we find in ourselves and expressed in them, were unchangeable, or were the only possible essence of thinking, that these conditions of our thinking were the conditions of any possible thinking. But we only know about our own thinking. We are not in a position to construct the picture of a thought different from our own, nor therefore that of a genus of thought for all these different sorts of thinking. Words that appear to describe such a genus have no sense that we can work out which would satisfy the claims raised by such an appearance. For every attempt to work out what they describe is bound to the conditions of our presentation and thinking, moves within their limits. If we lend to tempting expressions such as that of the essence of our thinking a currency in purely logical contexts, if, following our analyses, we interpret them as the sum total of ideal laws which determine the formal consistency of our thinking, we should naturally also claim to give a strict proof of what Erdmann thinks unprovable, that the essence of thought is unchangeable, that it is unique in its possibility, etc. It is clear, however, that Erdmann, in denying all this, does not stick to the only justifiable sense of essence of thinking. It is clear, as the quotation below will show more blatantly, that he thinks the laws of thought express the real essence of our thinking, that they are accordingly real laws, through which we have an immediate insight into the cognitive side of our common human constitution. This is unfortunately not the case. How could propositions which breathe no word regarding reality, which merely elucidate what is inseparably asserted in certain verbal or statement meanings of great generality, psychologism as a skeptical relativism 95 guarantee important real knowledge regarding, as we read a little further on, the essence of mental events, and, in short, of our soul? If, on the other hand, such laws or others did give us insight into the real essence of thinking, we should come to quite other conclusions than our esteemed thinker. We only know about our thinking. More precisely, as scientific psychologists we not only know about our own individual thinking, but a little about human thought in general, and a little less about animal thinking. A type of thinking which differs from ours in this real sense, and species of thinking beings that exemplify it, are at least things that we can conceive. They admit of a significant description, just as this is possible in the case of imaginary natural species. Böcklin has painted most magnificent centaurs and water sprites with the most concrete naturalness. We believe in them, at least aesthetically. Who can say if the laws of nature allow of such? If, however, we enjoyed final insight into the law-governed ways in which organic elements could be combined to constitute the organism's living unity, if we knew what laws keep the stream of becoming in its typically formed channels, we could form scientifically exact concepts of many objectively possible species, and add these to those that are actual, and such possibilities could be as squarely discussed as our imaginary types of gravitation in the writings of theoretical physicists. The logical possibility of such fictions is at least unassailable, whether in the field of natural science or that of psychology. Only when we make a NXL30 Chris E15 and AO and mix up the realm of psychological laws of thought with those of pure logic, and, further, misinterpret the latter psychologistically, will there be a shadow of justification for asserting our incapacity to imagine other modes of thinking, and for denying to the words that seem to describe these any achievable sense. Quite possibly we can form no real idea of such modes of thinking, quite possibly this is unachievable for us, but such unachievability in no case amounts to impossibility in the sense of what is senseless or absurd. Possibly the following discussion will assist understanding. Theorems belonging to the theory of abelian transcendence have no achievable sense for babies in arms, or for babies in mathematics, as mathematicians jestingly call us laymen. As adults stand to children, as mathematicians stand to us laymen, so a higher species of thinking beings, for example of angels, could stand to men. Such words and concepts have no achievable sense for us, since certain peculiarities of our mental constitution stand in the way. A normal man takes about 5 years to understand the theory of abelian functions or even to grasp its concepts. It might be the case that a millennium would be needed for a humanly constituted being to grasp angelic functions, though he can hardly hope to live as long as a century. But such an absolute unattainability, rooted in the natural limits of a specific constitution, would not be the one that absurdities and senseless statements offer. We are in one case concerned with propositions absolutely beyond our comprehension, though possibly consistent, and even valid in themselves. In the other case we understand propositions very well, but they are absurd, and we therefore cannot believe them, i.e. we see that, as absurd, they ought to be rejected. Let us now look at the extreme consequences which Erdmann deduces from his premises. Basing ourselves on the empty postulate of an intuitive thought, we must, on his view, admit the possible existence of a thought differing in essence from our own, from which he draws the conclusion that logical laws only hold within the limits of our thinking, without our being able to guarantee that this thinking might not alter in character. For it is possible that such a transformation should occur, whether affecting all or only some of these laws, since they are not all analytically derivable from one of them. It is irrelevant that this possibility is unsupported by the deliverances of our self-consciousness regarding our thinking. Though nothing presages its actualization, it remains a possibility. We can only take our thought as it now is, and are not in a position to fetter its future character to its present one. We are, in particular, incapable of so grasping the essence of our mental states, in brief of our soul, that we can deduce therefrom the unalterability of thought as it is given to us. 8. According to Erdmann, we cannot help admitting that all the propositions whose contradictories we cannot envisage in thought, are only necessary if we presuppose the character of our thought, as definitely given in our experience. They are not absolutely necessary, or necessary in all possible conditions. On this view our logical principles retain their necessity for our thinking, but this necessity is not seen as absolute, but as hypothetical, in our sense, as relative. We cannot help assenting to them, such is the nature of our presentation and thinking. They are universally valid, provided our thinking remains the same. They are necessary, since to think means for us to presuppose them, as long, that is, as they express the essence of our thinking. Compare opposite. NR 370, p. 378, I need not say, after my previous statement, how little I think these consequences are valid. It is certainly possible that there is a mental life essentially different from our own. Certainly we can only take our thinking for what it is, and it would certainly be stupid to try to deduce an permanence from the essence of our mental states, in brief of our soul. But from this the totally different possibility does not follow, that changes in our specific constitution could affect all or some logical principles, and that such principles have a merely hypothetical necessity. All this is absurd in the pregnant sense which has always been employed here, a sense strictly scientific psychologism as a skeptical relativism 97 and free from emotive tincture. It is the curse of our ambiguous logical terminology that such doctrines can still come up and can deceive serious thinkers. If the primitive conceptual distinctions of elementary logic had been completed, and terminology clarified on their basis, and we no longer dragged around with the wretched equivocations that attach to all logical terms, law of thought, form of thought, real and formal truth, presentation, judgment, proposition, concept, character, property, ground, necessity, etc., it would not be possible for absurdities as gross as relativism to be theoretically represented in logic and epistemology, nor could they have the plausibility by which even eminent thinkers are blinded. Talk of the possibility of variable laws of thought, as psychological laws of presentation and judgment differing in many respects for varying species of mental being, and even from time to time for one and the same species, all this has a good sense. For psychological laws are for us empirical laws, approximate generalities of coexistence and succession, relating to matters of fact which may in one case be thus, in another case otherwise. We even gladly allow the possibility of varying normative laws of presentation and judgment. Normative laws can certainly be adapted to the specific constitution of judging beings, and so vary with them. This obviously affects the rules of practical logic as a doctrine of method, as well as the methodological prescriptions of the separate sciences. Mathematical angels may no doubt use other methods of calculation than ours. Does this mean that they may have different axioms and theorems? This question carries us further. Talk of variable laws of thought only becomes absurd when we are referring to the laws of pure logic, to which may be added the pure laws of the theory of numbers, of ordinals, of sets, etc. The vague phrase normative laws of thought by which these are likewise designated, favors the general temptation to dump them all in together with our former psychologically founded rules of thinking. They, however, are purely theoretical truths, ideal in character, rooted in their own semantic content and not straying beyond it. They can accordingly not be affected by any actual or imagined change in the world of matter of fact. We must here keep in mind the threefold opposition, not merely the opposition between practical rule and theoretical law, or that between ideal law and real law, but also the opposition between an exact law and an empirical law, i.e. a statement of for the most part or average universality, governed by the principle no law without its exception. If our insight extended to the exact laws of mental process, these too would be eternal and unchangeable, as are the laws of theoretical natural science. They would therefore hold even if there were no mental processes at all. If all gravitating masses were eliminated, the law of gravitation would not thereby be suspended, it would merely lack the possibility of factual application. For it tells us nothing regarding the existence of gravitating masses, only regarding what pertains to gravitating masses as such. No doubt, as acknowledged above, an idealizing fiction plays its part in the setting up of exact laws of nature. Here we ignore this, confining ourselves to the mere intention of such laws. As soon as the exact character of logical principles is conceded, and they are seen in their exactness, the possibility of their being changed by changes in the collocations of what actually is, and of consequent transformations of zoological and mental species, is ruled out, and the eternal validity of such principles guaranteed. A defender of psychologism could here oppose our position by saying that the truth of logical principles, like all truth, has its seat in knowledge, and that knowledge as a mental experience is of course subject to psychological laws. But, without exhaustive discussion of the sense in which truth has its seat in knowledge, I yet point out that no change in psychological facts can turn knowledge into error, or error into knowledge. The arising and the perishing of phenomenal cases of knowledge, no doubt depends on psychological conditions, as does the arising and perishing of other mental phenomena, for example sensory ones. But, as no mental happenings can cause the red eye intuit not to be a color, but a tone, or the lower of two tones to be the higher, or, more generally, as what rests on the general nature of an experience is elevated above all possible change, since all change affects what is individual, and makes no sense in regard to concepts, so the same holds of contents of acts of knowledge. It pertains to the notion of knowledge that its content has the character of truth, a character which does not pertain to the evanescent phenomena of knowledge, but to their self-same content, to the ideal, universal element we have in mind when we say, for example, I know that a plus b equals b plus a, and countless other persons know it too. Of course errors can develop out of cases of knowledge, for example through fallacious inferences, but this does not turn knowledge as such into error, for one is merely causally tied up with the other. It may likewise be the case that a species of beings capable of judgment may develop no knowledge, that what they suppose true may always be false, and what they suppose false true. This would leave truth and falsehood intrinsically unaffected. They are essentially properties of the contents of such judgments, not of judgments as acts. They pertain to such contents even if no one recognizes their presence. Colors, tones, triangles etc. always have the essential properties of colors, tones, triangles etc. whether anyone in the world knows such a fact or not. The possibility, therefore, that Erdmann has sought to establish, that other beings might have quite different logical principles, cannot be accepted. An absurd possibility is an impossibility. One need only try to think out what his doctrine implies, that there might be peculiar beings, logical supermen, as it were, for whom our logical principles do not hold, but rather quite different principles, so that every truth for us is a falsehood for them. For them it is the case that the mental phenomena they are experiencing are not experienced by them. That we and they exist may be true for us, but is false for them etc. We everyday logicians would say, such beings are mad. Psychologism is a skeptical relativism 99. They talk of truth, yet destroy its laws. They say they have their own laws of thought, but they deny those on which the possibility of any such laws depends. They make assertions, yet countenance the denial of what they assert. Yes and no, truth and error, existence and non-existence, lose all their distinctness in their thought. Only they fail to notice their absurdities, which we notice, and see to be absurd in the most luminous fashion. Someone who tolerates such possibilities is divided only by a hair's breadth from the extremist skepticism. The subjectivity of truth is applied to the species instead of to the individual person. He is a specific relativist in the sense defined above, and is exposed to the objections we developed, which we shall not here repeat. For the rest I see no reason why we should stop at the boundaries of imaginary racial differences. Why not recognize real racial differences, differences between sanity and insanity, and all individual differences, as having an equal right? Perhaps a relativist will object to our appeal to inner evidence, to the evidence with which we see the absurdity of the possibility here suggested, by repeating what we quoted above, that it is irrelevant that this possibility is unsupported by our self-observation, since it is obvious that our thought cannot be at variance with its own forms. Ignoring such psychologistic interpretation of our thought forms, which was refuted above, we shall merely point out that such an expedient means absolute skepticism. If we have lost faith in the inwardly evident, how can we rationally make and sustain assertions? Perhaps, inasmuch as other people may be constituted as we are, and may incline to similar judgments in virtue of identical laws of thinking. But how can we know this, if we can know nothing whatever? Without insight, there can be no knowledge. It is really odd that men are prepared to put their trust in statements so dubious as those regarding what is common to human beings, but not in those mere trivialities, which though offering us only the slenderest instruction, grant us the clearest insight into what little they say. In this we can at least find nothing which relates to thinking beings and their specific peculiarities. The relativist cannot secure a temporarily improved position by saying that he is being treated as an extreme relativist. He is only a relativist as regards logical principles, while leaving other truths unassailed. This will not enable him to escape the general objections to specific relativism. For, if one relativizes the basic truths of logic, one relativizes all truth whatever. It is enough to consider the content of the law of contradiction and to draw some immediate consequences. Erdmann keeps far from such half measures. He has founded his logic on the relativistic concept of truth which his doctrine demands. His definition runs: the truth of a judgment consists in the fact that the logical immanence is subjectively, more specifically put, objectively, certain, and that the predicative expression of this immanence represents a necessity for thought, opposite. NR 278, p. 275. For an object is for Erdmann what is presented to us, and this in its turn is expressly identified with our presentation. In the same way, his objective or universal certainty is only apparently objective, since it is based on the general agreement of judging subjects, opposite p. 274. The expression objective truth is to be found in Erdmann's writing, but he identifies it with universal validity, i.e. validity for all. This is divided for him into certainty for all, and, if I understand him rightly, also into a necessity of thought for all. This is just what is meant by the above definition. It might seem a problem how, on this definition, we should ever rise to the justified assertion of even a single case of objective truth, and how we can escape the infinite regress that his definition demands, and of which the distinguished thinker is fully conscious. He does not, unfortunately, tell us enough on this point. The judgments in which we assert that others will agree with us are of course not, as he says, this agreement itself, but how does this help us? And how are we helped by our subjective certainty regarding such agreement? Our assertion would only be justified if we knew of the agreement, and this means if we perceived its truth. One might also ask how one ever came to be subjectively certain of the agreement of everyone, and, ignoring this difficulty, whether it is at all proper to demand such universal certainty, and whether truth may not rather be the appurtenance of a select few than possessed by everyone.